Hello, and welcome back to the history of Gallifrey. In this entry to the archive, we will be covering two more wars that Gallifrey went through, but heavily condensed, even more so than the Doctor's era. We have, of course, the War in Heaven and the Last Great Time War, but fear not, I plan to create two sub-series covering both of them individually in the future, so, without further ado, let's begin. For the War in Heaven, due to how history was in flux, many terms were changed. The Time Lords were known as the Great Houses, Gallifrey was known as the Homeworld, and TARDISes were simply timeships. For simplicity, all terms such as these will be changed back to what we know them as now, so instead of Great Houses it will just be Time Lords. We must also note that the name itself, War in Heaven, is not the official term, but instead one given to the war by the lesser species, unable themselves to comprehend the conflict before them, as the battlefield was not on a landscape, but in many cases history itself. The official term is W-time, similar to T-time, which eventually branched out into V-time at the end of the war, though unfortunately V doesn't stand for victory. With that out of the way, let's start at the beginning. Gallifrey's most infamous renegade returned several times over the course of decades, with warnings of an enemy preparing for war against the Time Lords. These warnings were largely ignored, climaxing in the head of the Presidency's attempt to disprove the rumours through the faraway Declaration. However, the Declaration instead proved the enemy's existence and malice, and so Gallifrey began to prepare for war, with the former renegade, who was in fact the Master, becoming the War King. In fear of the fight to come, the Celestial Intervention Agency preemptively erased themselves from time to become the non-corporeal Celestis. Increased tensions between the enemy representatives and Time Lord forces on Dronid climaxed in the Cataclysm and began the War in Heaven. Immediately, the Time Lord military engaged the enemy across N-space, including the thousand-year battles on Uttermost, Kaiwa, and Mohandasa. However, the approach of this first wave was ineffective against the enemy, leading to further innovations in subsequent waves. The enemy launched a direct attack on Gallifrey, which destroyed many technologies, including the Sash of Rassilon, Hand of Omega, and DMAT gun. Despite the attack having caught the Time Lords by surprise, the War King's preparations prevented Gallifrey's total destruction. The War in Heaven brought substantial changes to Gallifreyan society. Many renegade Time Lords like Barusa and the Rani returned to Gallifrey to assist in training soldiers. By the fourth wave, the military had begun recruiting Regen-Inf soldiers, or regeneration infantry from the lesser species, and, even more radically, incorporating foreign biodata into the looms. The Army of One project saw the Regen-Inf soldier Cwej multiplied into an entire army of Chwejian, with consequences that would outlast the war itself. Many New Blood chapters were created, and the identities of the 6 ruling chapters were constantly in flux, with a deep divide opening between the traditional political chapters and the new military ones. During the war, several duplicates of Gallifrey were constructed. These were collectively known as the 9 Gallifreys, though there were truly far more than just 9. Many of these duplicate worlds believed themselves to be the original, creating their own clone worlds. On one duplicate, ruled by Romana III, the Time Lords predicted the oncoming war by observing the war in the obverse. However, before the fighting reached her Gallifrey, it was attacked by faction Paradox forces led by Mother Mathara. To prevent the faction from taking control, the 8th Doctor destroyed Gallifrey. The Doctor preserved the minds of all the Time Lords by downloading the entire Matrix into his own mind, suppressing his memories. In the 6th decade of the war, Gallifrey was fighting against the enemy on 920 fronts. Lolita's chapter gained support among the War Council after its sole member, the rogue timeship Lolita, destroyed faction Paradox's 11-day empire. She successfully infiltrated several societies throughout N-space, becoming Queen of England, President of the United States, and, after killing the War King, Lady President of Gallifrey. However, she was defeated by the combined forces of Horus and the Osiran Court in a plot organised by Cousin Justine of faction Paradox. In the post-war universe, the Time Lords appeared to have been erased from history. 4 Time Lords were known to have survived, including the amnesiac 8th Doctor. He encountered a fellow survivor, Marnell, on Earth. Marnell attempted to hold him accountable for the destruction of Gallifrey, however relented when the Doctor discovered the Matrix's presence in his mind with the aid of K9. Though Marnell subsequently perished during the Vor invasion of Earth, The Doctor intended to find a way to fully restore the Time Lords, which was entirely possible, as he had previously glimpsed restored Time Lords in the Tomorrow Windows. According to one account, the planet was eventually restored to existence. During the period that followed, it was commonly referred to as the base of operations, and its inhabitants referred to themselves simply as the Superiors. The original Chris Cwej was subjected to the V-Time experiment, which stripped him of his flesh and transformed him into an artificial intelligence capable of possessing other Cwejan. The surgeon who performed the procedure told Cwej that the war had been an inevitable result of history balancing the Time Lords with an equal but opposite enemy, and that the solution was to divide the war's W-time into V-time, leaving just the superior perspective on reality. In the years that followed, Cwej was one of the Superior's most important agents in the outer universe, performing countless military missions and otherwise dwelling in the virtual world known as the Vicinity. The possibility that the enemy would resurface, reigniting the war in heaven, remained a source of worry for the Superiors, and led them to interfere with timelines on war-ravaged planets such as Golgolith. When Cwej admitted to harbouring the interdimensional fugitives, Lals and Qual, the High President pronounced the V-Time experiment a failure and sentenced Cwej to execution. However, the Vicinity reduced Cwej as it was being destroyed, and he returned into another body to shoot and kill the President. As a result, the Cwejan population was stirred into an uprising against the Superiors. Cwej went into hiding in a rebuilt version of the Vicinity. Meanwhile, a Cwej named Thomas Macaray took command of the uprising, which became increasingly violent. Years later, Cwej was pulled out of hibernation by Christina Cwej. She brought him to Macaray, who wished to recruit him. After an encounter with the superior criminal Cwej, also known as the Master, Cwej attempted to use the Praxis-filled Tree of Life to rewrite history and erase the uprising. However, Cwej distracted him telepathically, causing the uprising to be only half erased, and leading to an unstable new status quo. Cwej then quit the service of the Superiors. After a timeline change by Braxiatel and the Watchmaker, meaning Romana didn't regenerate on the Moros and stepped down as president for Livia, hostilities between the Time Lords and the Dalek Empire began to escalate. Various Time Lord factions began to prepare for war, which the Matrix had begun to predict as an inevitability. Cardinal Prime Padrak assembled a coalition of renegades to take over Gallifrey and destroy the rest of the universe, just to safeguard the Time Lords. Their scheme was stopped by the Eighth Doctor and Helen. Under Cardinal Rasmus began research into alternative power sources, in case the Eye of Harmony was compromised on Deeptime Frontier, which resulted in the release of the last surviving Ravenous. Deputy CIA Coordinator Narvin undertook clandestine missions under the title of Coordinator in Extremis to avert the war, which his superior Coordinator Romana was well aware of. Narvin recruited the Reborn Master to use the Eminence against the Daleks. However, the Master went rogue, using the Eminence to his own ends, forcing Narvin to work with the Doctor to stop him. Narvin would later recruit the Master again, but in his War Master incarnation, to obtain Swenyo needed for construction of battleships from Callus. By this point, Narvin had accepted the war as inevitable. Eventually, President Livia founded the War Council, which frequently came into conflict with the CIA and commenced Project Revenant to enable the resurrections of Time Lords. The Daleks began attacking the temporal powers, seeking to eliminate potential allies of the Time Lords. After the fall of Phaidon, President Livia called for a halt in the rivalry between the CIA and the War Council, following the CIA's discovery of Project Revenant, and, hours later, officially declared the last Great Time War against the Daleks. In the early days of the war, the Time Lords fought the Daleks at Kitol, the Spiral Firl, the Gates of Elysium, the Obscura, Ceremithius V, and Sarakasar. The Time Lords did, initially, not regard the conflict as a true war, rather a series of skirmishes. Despite the conflict dragging on, some of the High Council kept believing it was just one more battle displaying Time Lord supremacy, which would hopefully send the Daleks fleeing. The Time Lords turned away from governing established history and protecting the web of time, and instead threw all their resources into battling the Daleks and their allies. The War Council sent a reactivation signal to any surviving N-forms, and dreadnoughts, including the Septima, were assembled in the quantum yards to assault Serifia. A group of Gallifreyan children working in a munitions factory on Gallifrey were targeted by Daleks from a later point in the war, and were saved by the War Doctor from the same future time period. The Time Lords achieved victories in the Navara Cluster and the Prialus system. The War Master was commissioned by the Time Lords to create the Rage and War Seeds. He was eventually recruited directly by the CIA, however quickly went rogue. The 12 was used as an agent of the High Council, equipped with a neural inhibitor to keep her other incarnations' personalities in check. 2 months into the war, Project Revenant was destroyed by the CIA to prevent the Daleks capturing it after they invaded the pocket dimension where it was housed. However, its true purpose was served regardless, as Rassilon was resurrected by the War Council. He was declared Lord President Eternal, establishing a new regime that made Livia his Prime Minister, and dismantled the Chancellery Guard in favour of Cardinal Mantis's Interior Defence Unit. Rassilon declared that any worlds who refused to aid the Time Lords in their campaign would be considered hostile, and in the first year of the war he wiped out the Tharals, the Prophew, and the Karanju, so they couldn't threaten Time Lord supremacy. After learning that Rassilon had authorized the destruction of the neutral planet Yalsus as an example, CIA coordinator Romana attempted to assassinate him via the Sicari incursions. She failed, though forced him to regenerate, and was exiled from Gallifrey with her deputy Narvin, with the CIA being subsumed into the IDU. After his regeneration, Rassilon largely distanced himself from the running of government, delegating to Livia and Mantis in the capital, and the General and Illustra in the field, and became obsessed with the idea of Time Lords ascending to higher dimensions. In the course of their campaign, the Time Lords forced alliances and collaborated with many other powers. This included old foes of the Daleks, such as the Thals, the Anti-Dalek Force, and localized resistance groups, such as those on Uzmal. The Time Lords also worked with the Nestine Consciousness, the Vord, and employed the Tharal Birok as a spy. The Doctor refused to join the Time Lords' cause, though his granddaughter Susan did answer their call to arms. Cardinal Illustra attempted to conscript him on the Moon of Tenacity, but was forced to abandon the effort when the Daleks invaded. The Doctor did occasionally work with the Time Lords away from the front lines, such as investigating Dr. Ogron, assisting the Uzmal resistance, helping Major Tamazan track down Shonath, and attempting to save Oscar's world. Over time, the Doctor's stance against his people hardened, after witnessing actions such as their occupation of Delarobia, devastation of Drakis, and bombings on Reeve. After his recreation, the Time Lords pressed the Valeyard into service. Without the Doctor's morality, the Valeyard won them many battles, and managed to erase the Daleks completely by turning their own superweapon against them on Grav, where the Time Lords promptly imprisoned him in a time lock. As a side effect of the superweapon, the Time Lords lost all memory of the Daleks, leaving them to decommission a war effort without understanding why they actually fought it, and their prisoner of war camps were filled with former conscripts who had surrendered after forgetting their superiors. Rassilon ordered they all be kept imprisoned, regardless of their cooperation, so the Time Lords could discover who their enemy had been. During this time, the Eighth Doctor returned to Gallifrey, also losing his memory of the Daleks, and subsequently working with the General and Cardinal Rasmus to investigate an unknown enemy, and the 12 attempted to use a Dreadshade to force her way onto the High Council. Her attempt backfired, when she reminded the Time Lords of the Daleks, restoring their memories and losing her control of the Dreadshade. The General believed that the Time Lords would now return to non-interference. However, upon taking away the Dreadshade from Gallifrey, the Doctor remembered the reason he had returned in the first place was to warn the Time Lords of the imminent restoration of the Daleks. Despite the Time Lords' efforts to prevent the Daleks' return to the universe at the Gulf of Ethan, the Dalek time strategist was able to stabilize the Dalek Empire's existence, using dimensional engineering, recommencing the Time War. After dying on Kharn, the Doctor was finally convinced by the Sisterhood that he could not escape the war, and so regenerated into a warrior. After initially choosing to fight as a free agent, the War Doctor eventually fought alongside the Time Lords for centuries, including at Skull Moon and the Keska incident, gaining a reputation among Gallifreyan soldiers. He served under the command of Commodore Tamazan and Cardinal Illustra. Sontarans told legends of the Doctor leading Time Lords into battle. A resistance to Rassilon's rule grew from exiled Time Lords and aliens whose worlds had been devastated by his campaign. Rassilon issued 2 speeches in response, first condemning the resistance and calling for their extermination, rhetoric which unsettled Livia, and then denouncing them as irrelevant. The exiled Narvin agreed to help the Resistance's plan, to pollute the time vortex to deprive both sides of time travel, and they constructed a stealth battle TARDIS primed to detonate, intended to be placed at the Untempered Schism. As the Resistance initiated their plan, with Narvin and Leela piloting the TARDIS into Kasterborous, the Daleks launched a gambit to seize Gallifrey with null zone technology by using it to pilot a saucer right above Gallifrey, bypassing the time vortex and planetary defences. Whilst the Daleks waited for their null zone power source to recharge, Rassilon ordered the 5th Battle Fleet to attack them, which proved futile, and then summoned more forces and conscripted Livia and Mantis into the fight. They were intercepted by Narvin, and worked with him to detonate the battle TARDIS on board the saucer, as he realised the plan was useless if the Daleks could simply bypass the vortex. After the incident, Rassilon decided to take a more personal role into the conduct of the Time War, personally overseeing Leela's conscription. The Time Lords allied with the Technomancers to resurrect their soldiers. After discovering this alliance, the War Doctor wiped the Technomancers out upon learning they were exploiting the arrangement to bring the Horned Ones into existence. For this act, Cardinal Alystra had him imprisoned as a war criminal. To regain his freedom, Alystra manipulated him into investigating the Anima device and the Never When, where the Doctor found hundreds of Time Lord soldiers stuck in a perpetual battle. The Doctor continued to answer to Alystra, stopping Daleks invading Earth via the Shadow Vortex, rescuing her from Sontarans, and helping her escape from the Time Strategist forces, which subsequently pursued them. When the Dalek Time Strategist blackmailed the Enigma, Gallifrey was briefly overwritten to be a Dalek planet, until the War Doctor convinced it to stand up to the Daleks and play no further part in the war, though he did suggest that it could wipe out both sides to finally end the conflict. This caused him and Alystra to fall out. The War Doctor later attempted to stop Alystra's plan to unleash the Great Vampires on the Dalek fleet. After more than 400 years of war, the Dalek Eternity Circle developed the temporal cannon and the Tantalus Eye, intending to fire it at Gallifrey and erase it from history. After being warned of the scheme by the War Doctor, Rassilon, now in a new incarnation, devised a plan to foil their scheme by detonating the Tear of Isha in the Eye, wiping out numerous planets in the process. In the ensuing battle for the Tantalus Eye, the War Doctor saw the destruction of the cannon and Gallifrey's survival by alternate means. Appalled by the Time Lord's measures, the War Doctor turned against his people, vowing to end the war for good. Rassilon officially declared the War Doctor a traitor, and exiled him from Gallifrey. After they successfully assaulted Kasterborous, the last days of the war saw the Daleks breach Gallifrey's defences and invade Gallifrey's second city, Arcadia. The Doctor left a message for the Time Lords at the battle: "No more," and then stole the moment from the Omega Arsenal, intending to destroy both sides and finally end the war. Refusing to die, Rassilon initiated the ultimate sanction, to end time itself and free the Time Lords from their physical bodies. He implanted a 4-beat signal into the Master's mind, and then sent a white point star diamond into 2009 Earth. With the drumming as a signal and the diamond as a connection, the Saxon Master, who had survived the war, broke the time lock at the end of the war, and pulled a group of the Time Lords through to Earth, and also pulled Gallifrey through, beginning a chain reaction which would tear the time vortex apart. However, Gallifrey was returned to the last day of the Time War inside of the time lock, when the 10th Doctor destroyed the white point star within the nuclear bolt that was generating the signal, with the Master returning on Rassilon and attacking him, resulting in him being brought into the Time War. Unable to breach the capital's sky trenches, the Daleks surrounded and bombarded Gallifrey. Thanks to the moment, the Doctor found an alternative to destroying Gallifrey. He worked with 12 of his other incarnations to freeze Gallifrey and the surviving Time Lords in time, and transfer Gallifrey into a pocket universe, like a painting, where it was safe from the Daleks, who destroyed themselves in their own crossfire. The shock from this transition caused various natural disasters to befall Gallifrey, with rescue operations being overseen by the 12th Doctor, who had summoned a blizzard of versions of himself from along his timeline. Due to the memory of these events being wiped from every incarnation before the 11th Doctor, the 9th Doctor believed himself responsible for the destruction of both the Time Lords and Gallifrey. For their part, the Time Lords considered themselves to be safe in their pocket universe, though not in a better position than before. While the Time Lords were readily capable of leaving and returning to N-Space, they had no actual way of determining which of the nearby universes was theirs. However, at least one account showed that the widespread belief in the Time Lord's destruction was correct, with the 11th Doctor encountering a version of the Matrix which had been driven to demented sentience by the sudden death of all the Time Lords on Gallifrey at the hands of the Doctor. The upload of these millions of Gallifreyans' experiences to the Matrix had overloaded its system and turned it into one jumbled sentient entity thirsting for revenge. Having been born of untold death, it knew no other purpose than to visit the same death on the rest of creation, by enacting Rassilon's final sanction itself. The 12th Doctor would later state that Gallifrey had originally been destroyed, but he broke every law of time and rewrote history to save it. And that is the story of Gallifrey's part in the War in Heaven and the Last Great Time War. Both are the most significant conflicts in Gallifrey's history, that fact cannot be disputed, but while the Time War is very well known, the War in Heaven has almost sunk into myth, a very confusing and difficult to access conflict that is completely overshadowed by its successor, so much so that this is the first video on YouTube to go through it in any capacity. Does that make me a pioneer? The thing is though, both of them are essentially meaningless, just like the previous two in the last part. The Eternal War, the first of the three great Time Wars, led the Time Lords to become the most powerful creatures in the universe, and vanquished the only credible threat against them, propelling them forward. The second Time War, or the War in Heaven, either was over before it started, or was completely undone at the end of it. Either way, it technically didn't happen, and was completely erased from continuity, the enemy never being revealed, and the Time Lords going on, for better or for worse. Third, and the last great Time War, was perhaps the bloodiest, but by the end both the Time Lords and Daleks still existed in the post-Time War universe, and while the Daleks didn't wipe out the Time Lords as they had hoped, they did force them into exile at first in another universe, and as we'll discuss in the next part, at the end of Endspace, meaning technically they did actually win, being allowed to conquer freely in the post-Time War universe, though never quite reaching the power level they held at the end of the war. So did it really matter in the end? Did anything change? No. But maybe that's intentional. A theory I quite like is that the moment was left in the Omega Arsenal, as its true power was to loop the conflict until a favourable outcome was reached. For the Doctor, of course, that was for the Time Lords to survive and the war to be over, with the drawback that a few Daleks survived as well. Why didn't the High Council use it? Well, Rassilon wanted to ascend, and the War Council would have preferred to have ended the war on their terms, the total extermination of the Daleks, so never would have used it. But anyway guys, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this rather long video and made it to the end, then consider leaving a like and subscribing down below, as it really helps out the channel. I plan on making 2 sub-series based on both the War in Heaven and the Last Great Time War, with the Time War being the most uncertain of the two in how it will be formatted, as there is so much content to cover within it. I'll have to figure something out. The next part will be the final in our series, and also perhaps the most boring, but please do stay tuned for that. But, as always, thanks for watching.